Well, welcome everyone to the Colonial Society of Massachusetts. I'm Bob Allison, president of the society, and this is our third Donald Friary Symposium. We thought symposium was better than lecture since these are turned into conversations, and I'm happy that Donald Friary is here with us. He is our president emeritus, and we created these sessions in recognition of his long service to the society and to public history in general. And I thank you for coming, Don. And I'd like to thank Anne Cesary, who is our organizer of events, and she is in the back. And if you have questions during the program and you're not in the room, you can email them to colonialsociety@verizon.net. And someone is standing by to field questions. And now I will introduce our very distinguished panel for a conversation about the global reach of colonial New England, or something of that nature. And we actually have an all-star panel here. First, on my left is Joyce Chaplin. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I do this all the time.
I wrote down everything else about you. But Joyce Chaplin is the James Duncan Phillips Professor of Early American History at Harvard. Yes, I got that one right. And she is also heading to Venice soon for the summer. So we're happy to have you here. We're fitting this in between here and Venice. She's written a number of terrific books. The First Scientific American, which is a book about Benjamin Franklin as a natural philosopher. And that book required her actually to go out on the Gulf Stream and measure the Gulf Stream. She's also wrote a book about Round About the Earth, which is on circumnavigation of the globe from Magellan to the space program. And she's also just recently co-edited written with Alison Bashford, The New Worlds of Thomas Robert Malthus. So she's a distinguished scholar of all kinds of things pertaining to early American global history. So thank you for joining us. And next is Asheesh Siddique, who is an assistant professor of history at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. And he is he's just finished a book on archives and governance in the early, actually he's written an article on archives and governance in the early republic, and he's just finished a book on experiencing
archives and difference in the early modern world.
Archives and difference in the early modern world, which will be published next year. He's written a series of articles about archives, about the British Empire, and about actually an essay on beyond Somerset slavery and the temporality of law in that period. So he's really a scholar of the British Empire and archives, publishing in places like the Journal of British Studies, the William and Mary Quarterly, the Journal of Early Modern History, and other distinguished journals. So thank you for joining us, Asheesh, recently elected to membership of the Society. As is our final panelist, Jane Hooper, who is an associate professor of history, as well as the director of undergraduate history programs at George Mason University. And her first book was Feeding Globalization on Madagascar and the Provisioning Trade from 1600 to 1800. And her second book is Yankees in the Indian Ocean, American Commerce and Whaling from 1786 to 1860. And she is also right now one of the lead investigators on a study of the slave trade in the Indian Ocean and in Asia under the auspices of the National Endowment for the Humanities. So three distinguished scholars. I know I've left out many of your accomplishments, but you would not have time to say anything. So really delighted to have you here, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think I've been selected to go first, even though I think I'm going to be speaking about a relatively broad time span, as you'll see. And I just want to begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me here. It's been a wonderful visit, and especially coming here as somebody who works in the Indian Ocean. I feel very much out of my element in this, for a multitude of reasons. And so I really wanted to start with two individuals that help explain why I study early American history as somebody who works on the Indian Ocean. And I wonder this as you're hearing me talk about my books. And the first individual I would speak about is named Adam Baldridge. Adam Baldridge in 1691 was a pirate merchant in the Caribbean before he went to Madagascar. He set up an establishment in Madagascar. He married a local ruler's daughter, and he began investigating the slave trade and sending slaves, in fact, enslaved peoples from Madagascar to New England, and through the auspices of his backer in New England, and especially in New York. And he also traded with the pirates who were operating out of the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea during this time. And as you can imagine, this made the British very upset. We'll be hearing more about the British in a little bit. So the British sent ships to move the pirates out of Madagascar. Unfortunately for the British, when they arrived, Adam Baldridge had already fled Madagascar. Reportedly, he had sold the wrong Malagasy into slavery and really upset some of the local rulers. He came back to New England and he asked his backers in New York to set up a colony in Madagascar. This is in the 1690s, to sell slaves to the Americas, and they never seem to have backed this. His name appears again in the archives about 30 years later. In the 1730s, a French slave merchant arrives in eastern Madagascar and is greeted by a king who refers to himself as King Baldridge. He is, according to the French records, light-skinned, clearly mixed race, accompanied by wives who are also a mixed race, and he is dressed in fine European clothing. The French, however, fail to connect him with his earlier slave trader, and it's clear that the Malagasy themselves have assumed this American name in trying to broadcast their connections with the Atlantic world. My second individual is about a century later. His name is Vincent Marks. In the 1830s, he was the person from New England who was in charge of setting up monopoly trading in northwestern Madagascar. He lived in the town of Majunga, and he organized commerce for Salem merchants that were arriving in search of cattle hides and food to go back to Salem. So for about 30 years, he was the only merchant who was exporting goods from northwestern Madagascar, connected with the rulers of Madagascar, and sending goods back to New England. And then, when he died around 1858, I believe, his cousin took over the rule and the control of commerce. But at this point, by the 1860s, American commerce was declining anyway because of the Civil War. So I'm going to begin with these two individuals, Adam Baldridge, the pirate, and Vincent Marks, the merchant, because there's actually a lot of commonalities in their stories and about the ways in which Americans have been involved in the Indian Ocean. The first one is rather obvious on the face of it, which is that Americans were almost always involved in slavery and the slave trade in the Indian Ocean. And this is beginning in the 17th, 18th, into the 19th centuries. Under the pirate trafficking of Baldridge and many others, just shy of 1,000 enslaved peoples came from Madagascar to the Americas. Many of them came to the Caribbean, others came to New York, they came to the Carolinas, they came to Virginia. Even after the pirates ended their attachment to the slave trade in Madagascar, the British set up the South Sea Company, which was meant to also profit from the same slave trafficking, and they sent slightly over 2,000 enslaved Malagasy to the Americas. Again, many of these arriving in New England. And then, just fast forwarding to Vincent Marks' period of time, we have another massive numbers of Americans involved in slave trafficking in the Indian Ocean, this time on East Africa, right around Mozambique. We know that over 15,000 enslaved Africans were carried on U.S. ships to the Americas during this time. This was largely illegal slave trading, going to Cuba and going to Brazil. And the other point that I would make here is, in addition to this massive American involvement in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, Americans were also indirectly involved in supporting slaving ventures and slave trading in the Indian Ocean. The goods that they purchased in the Indian Ocean were being produced by slave labor. This was sugar from Mauritius, coffee from Réunion. If you're going to East Africa, the cloves and the other goods that are being exported to American merchants were all being produced with slave labor. But also, Americans were bringing two goods into East Africa that were very much in demand and contributing to the rise of slave trafficking throughout the entire Indian Ocean. This is cotton cloth and gunpowder. And through these means, Americans were able to dramatically shape the slave trading within the Indian Ocean as well. The other point I would make, though, from these two individuals is the ways in which American trafficking in the Indian Ocean was really flexible. Americans were able to go and make negotiations outside of imperial structures. Americans went places that the British, the French, the Portuguese, other imperial powers couldn't go. They could make negotiations with a variety of rulers, whether in Madagascar, in Zanzibar, even trying to avoid embargoes in various places like the Mascarenes. Americans were able to be flexible and respond to these economic opportunities. But the contrast is that Americans were unable to set up stable structures for commerce in the Indian Ocean. They were unable to set up stable colonial holdings. The United States was unwilling to send naval fleets in support of American commerce. And so, as I mentioned earlier, after the Civil War, the American presence in the Indian Ocean virtually disappeared. And Americans were far more focused on other parts of Asia and the Pacific. So I just want to simply end by stating that I think Americanists often don't think a lot about the Indian Ocean, especially southeastern Africa and Madagascar. The ways in which that part of the world is actually very important to American commerce, even though we do talk more extensively about India or the Pacific world. But I think the contrast is also true, which is scholars of the Indian Ocean know very little about American involvement, which is why these two individuals are so surprising to me to uncover them in the archives. That scholars who look at places like Madagascar and East Africa think about the Portuguese, the French, the British, the Omanis, they think about other imperial structures. They discount the Americans because they don't have a large empire backing them at this time in the Indian Ocean. But I would argue that through these accounts of these two individuals, you can see that Americans were actually very important, not just economically, but also social, cultural, other contributions to the history of the region. So, thank you.
Well, thanks, Jane, and I think my comments will pick up, I think, on a number of the things that you mentioned. So I will start with a confession, which is that I was actually, even though I teach early American history now, I was actually not trained as an early Americanist, but as a historian of the early modern British Empire. And so I kind of come to the question of early America and the world, or colonial New England and the world, as someone who has never really thought of colonial New England as isolated or segmented from many of the broader dynamics that shaped the early modern world. Instead, I think of colonial New England as one of the many sites in the early modern British Empire where some of the major structural dynamics and tensions that we see playing out across imperial space also mattered. These included things like tensions between metropolitan directives and local on-the-ground ideas of how empire should be governed, trade and commercial exchange, and imperial violence, especially as directed at First Peoples and African peoples. And this perspective is, I think, in keeping with recent scholarship that has done so much to recenter the connections between New England and the Atlantic world, especially on the fundamental issue of slavery. I'm thinking here especially of the work of scholars such as Margaret Allen Buell, Nicole Maskill, Wendy Warren, Jared Hardesty, and Gloria Whiting, as well as earlier work by scholars like Lorenzo Green and William Pearson, whose research powerfully demonstrated that the two most important processes that shaped the world of early modern Atlantic empires, namely the enslavement of African and African-descended peoples and the dispossession of First Peoples through war and forced relocation, were really just as central to the making of colonial New England as they were to other parts of the early American world, even though these processes tend not to be associated with New England, at least I think in the public imagination of what early America was. New England colonists certainly enslaved indigenous and African peoples, even though not at the same extent, perhaps, as the plantation agriculture economies of the South and the Caribbean. And New England merchants certainly invested in and profited from the slave trade, both during the colonial period and after independence, especially through their investment in cotton. We also know that even after American independence, and with it the institution of gradual emancipation laws in the northern United States, slavery also persisted as an institution in the North for decades afterward. In places like Rhode Island, slavery didn't become illegal until 1842, and in New Hampshire in 1857. And so I think, for me, when I kind of think about colonial New England and the world, I see it as a place where we are beginning to understand that many of these dynamics that we've recognized as fundamental to the making of the Atlantic world more broadly played out. And I think thanks to the phenomenal scholarship that I've just highlighted, as well as to work of many other scholars that I don't have time to mention, we now think of colonial New England as part of this broader Atlantic world and shaped by these defining processes. But I also think that we can push a bit further and consider some of the manifold ways in which colonial New England was also connected to the early modern world beyond the Atlantic itself, some of which I think scholarship is still only just beginning to explore. The first, I think, is that early English thinking about colonization and trade in New England and North America was inseparable from early English thinking about trade in South Asia. And as Jane was just talking about, I think for a bit of a later period, those connections were present. And in some ways, they were also present, perhaps not in social and economic processes, but certainly in the mental processes of early English thinkers about trade and colonization. I'll just mention one of these people, the 16th century imperial promoter and writer Richard Hakluyt, who wrote as much about English colonization and English trade in both New England and India, and saw English ventures into both New England and into South Asia as part of a project of trying to shore up the power of Protestantism against its rivals, Catholicism in the Atlantic world and Islam in South Asia. Many of the same English merchants who invested in 17th century English imperial corporations that pursued trade and settlement in the Atlantic world, such as the Virginia Company, also invested in the East Indian Company, which was pursuing something quite similar in South Asia at the time. And as scholars such as Caroline Frank and Jonathan Eckett have shown us, from the 1660s onwards, Indian and Chinese goods imported by the English East India Company into England began to also be sold by merchants into the nascent consumer markets of the English Atlantic world. And these products, from silk and cotton to spices and tea, became hot commodities in the Americas. And for obvious reasons, tea looms large here, given its involvement in the later history of colonial protest. I'll kind of close by mentioning another way in which I think colonial New England was connected to this broader world by talking about two people who we often kind of think of as perhaps in terms of perhaps the colonial history as perhaps part of New England history, but who also were involved in these kinds of dynamics. And the first one who I want to mention is Robert Boyle, the mid-17th century Anglo-Irish natural philosopher, who is probably best known today perhaps for Boyle's Law, which if you would like to relive the trauma of high school physics class, is what we're reminded of any time we open a carbonated beverage, right, which states that at a constant temperature, the pressure exerted by a gas is inversely proportional to the volume it occupies, so that if you pressurize gas, its volume contracts, and when you release that pressure, its volume increases. Boyle, though, was also involved in empire building in both colonial New England and South Asia. He was a director of the English East India Company and of the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in New England from the 1660s through his death in 1691. And in both cases, he worked diligently to use those associations to promote Christianity and the conversion of both Indians in India and Indians in New England to it. Another example of these, I think, connections that are all over the early American history, but which I think perhaps we don't think about as much today, is the figure of Elihu Yale, who today I think is best known as the benefactor behind the founding of Yale University in the early 18th century. But I think, like Boyle, Yale's life demonstrates the interconnections between colonial New England and the broader imperial world as well. Yale was born in Boston in 1649, but he made his fortune as a servant of the English East India Company from the 1670s, when he began working for the company at its trading outpost, Fort St. George, in Madras, what is today the city of Chennai, on the Bay of Bengal in eastern India. And so Yale himself rose up through the ranks of the East India Company's administration to become the company's governor at Fort St. George between 1687 and 1692. And he eventually donated books, textiles, art, and money to what was at the time the Collegiate School in New Haven, which renamed itself Yale College in his honor in 1718. So I think if we think, we've talked a little bit about people, but we can also think in some ways of institutions that I think we associate with colonial New England that also are very much part of this broader world of New England in the early modern world. In early American institutions that were underwritten by their involvement in these broader global processes, which may not always be quite as apparent to us today, but I think we're very much on the minds of people in the early modern world. Thanks.
Well, thank you both. I hope I can make some comments that would be interesting to put in dialogue. With this material, I'm going to begin with an anecdote, which is the first thing that popped into my mind when the Colonial Society began discussing this panel on colonial New England and the world. This is something that happened several years ago, just after I published the book on global history, Roundabout the Earth, Circumnavigation from Magellan to Orbit, which came out in 2012, slightly more than a decade ago. That was hard to kind of take on board, but there it is. Soon after it was published, like within the year, I got an email from the dean's office at Harvard stating that the trustees of my endowed chair were concerned. So my chair is designated as the James Duncan Phillips Professorship in Early American History, and the trustees objected that my book on the history of around the world travel was not a contribution to early American history, so what did I think I was doing? So among other things, I explained that the book was definitely about imperial history and that the colonization of early America was an example of that. That didn't work. The trustees, in fact, upped the ante by pointing out that the original terms of the bequest had asked that, all things being equal, the chair's incumbent specialized in early New England history, not just early America, but early New England history. And the bequest, made in the early part of the 20th century, had expressed a desire that he, the chair was originally stipulated as for a man, that he be from an old New England family. So quite the package of expectations. To make a long story short, however, I was asked for several years to submit an annual report on my publications and teaching, anything that I'd done related to early America, also highlighting those relevant to the history of New England. So this continued until there was a new dean who kind of managed the trustees better. There's probably a lesson here in what a university's accepting private donations may entail, though that's not the lesson that I'm going to go into here today. What I want to point out, and did point out to the Phillips trustees, was that James Duncan Phillips himself, as a popular writer and history enthusiast, had published several histories that put New England into a bigger and even global context. So these included his 1949 book, which I still kind of recommend, Pepper and Pirates, Adventures in the Sumatra Pepper Trade of Salem. And in this, Phillips not only ably connected New England to the world in a certain way, but he publicized the fact that this history was well documented locally. His author bio says James Duncan Phillips comes honestly by his knowledge of Salem. His great-great-fathers were pioneers in the pepper trade. Fortunately, the records of these adventures are also to be found in the manuscript vaults of the Essex Institute and the Peabody Museum. But interestingly, by 2012, the caretakers of the James Duncan Phillips bequest to Harvard had forgotten all of this. Somehow the connections between the global and the local were no longer as self-evident. So this is why I want to start with the 1949 date. of Pepper and Pirates, to talk about how New England's perceived place in the world has varied over time and meant different things, and how the scholarship being done now represents a longer history of understanding what those connections might mean, which I hope could be useful to how we see that connection between the region and the world for teaching, research, and public discussion today. So, 1949, right after World War II. This was, for both popular understanding of the United States and academic research into its history, the moment when the United States dominated the world stage. Sense of the nation's global power had, of course, been growing all along. Most obviously, I guess the earliest indication would have been the perceived influence that the United States had on revolts against European imperialism in the Americas during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And then continuing, if not quite a matching way, with U.S. imperialist expansion in the greater Caribbean and Pacific during the 19th and 20th centuries. So there's a longer, earlier history, both historical experiences of the United States as an empire of ideas of liberation, and then as just an empire. These both went into accumulating interpretations of the U.S. global presence in the 20th century, but especially after World War II and during the Cold War. So it was in the second half of the 20th century, not least, that early American history took off, as you can see by rebranding of the William and Mary Quarterly, and this, in a sense, reshaped the field into its more or less current form as a primary source-based examination of the colonial past, predominantly, or at least beginning, with the 13 colonies that would break with Britain and form the United States in 1776. So eventually with Atlantic history and the new continental history and then global history beyond those 13 provinces. But it's that origin story at first of the United States alone that was the scholarly field's meal ticket. The reason why academic deans, government or private foundations, undergraduate students, and the general public paid attention to what they might otherwise have considered a kind of ye olde remote period of American history. This was quite definitely the idiom in which James Duncan Phillips thought of the history of colonial New England, as the story of early American connections to faraway parts of the world as he established between Salem and Sumatra, with an underlying assumption that the point of this history was to document a kind of wonderful Yankee entrepreneurship. So New Englanders profiting from those other places. Phillips' work may now seem antiquarian in some ways, but the long-distance nets of Yankee commercial cunning would have a large presence even in academic studies, as with Bernard Bailyn's New England Merchants in the 17th Century, based on his dissertation, and published in 1955, so not that long after Pepper and Pirates, in this concern with New England as a kind of shipping entrepot, appeared in multiple other monographs and articles on New Englanders' fishing, whaling, shipbuilding, and commercial transport. So profit and commerce, but these were only one way in which early New Englanders were seen to impact the world. The other, and maybe somewhat better kind of global connection or influence would be the American Revolution, understood as an anti-imperial revolt. Here, too, there's a big historiography with too many titles or authors to list. I won't do that. I'm going to throw out one representative example, R.R. Palmer's The Age of Democratic Revolution, A Political History of Europe and America, 1760 to 1800, published in 2 volumes, 1959, 1964, one of which won, I think, the Pulitzer Prize, and depicting a large Atlantic sphere of revolution that, if anything, kept spilling outward. So into, say, the Latin American revolts associated with Simón Bolívar. In this kind of interpretation, New Englanders, sometimes convincingly, retained a sort of pride of place as residents of the region within British America that had supposedly an outsized influence on revolutionary events, depending on how these were defined. So Virginia obviously offers up General Washington to the cause, as well as numerically more early presidents. But meanwhile, New England seems to have had some of the most vociferous insurgents and the longest list of revolutionary publications, as with pamphlets. And this is, to some extent, a real perception, not just a kind of boosterism for the region. So one example, in America, A Prophecy, the British radical poet William Blake opens with invocation of Washington, Franklin, Payne and Warren, Gates, Hancock and Greene. So listing 2 native Englishmen, one who settled in Virginia and the other in Pennsylvania, 1 Virginian himself, and then 4 native New Englanders, including Franklin, and kind of registering a prowess, especially on the battlefield, associated with New England men. Connected to this sense that New England was the brains behind modern liberation movements were other definitions of its worldwide networks, including a kind of Protestant international, as with Boyle, for instance. So from the diasporic communities of early modern Calvinist refugees to clergymen and others who went elsewhere, and going on into the work of modern missionaries, even into the early 20th century, as with Bostonians in Asia, particularly China. If New England was being built up into some kind of hemispheric or global actor, this kind of wintry, hyper-literate place that punches above its weight, I think it was inevitable that this characterization of it would eventually reveal some flaws, or that the interpretation might be entirely flipped to explain the region's rather insidious global presence. And New England missionaries themselves are a case in point. They were once regarded as brave emissaries. It's hard to recover the kind of heroism that surrounded these families, these kind of global sophisticates who built a regional prowess eventually for U.S. diplomacy. This kind of activity is now considered imperialism of a pretty undiluted sort, and just to name one recent title, Emily Conrad Krutz's Christian Imperialism, Converting the World in the Early American Republic, published in 2015, among other recent studies that have reanalyzed what this kind of global dimension for New Englanders meant. In some ways, this adjustment has been to identify New England's larger influences that are less uplifting. Consider Wendy Warren's book and the other titles that Jane mentioned. Wendy Warren's New England Bound on enslavement here. Also, Linford Fisher's ongoing project, Stolen Relations, recovering stories of indigenous enslavement in the Americas, with its identification of New England enslavers' conspicuous role in exploitation in all manner of trading captives, including the forced exile of New England Pequots and others into the Caribbean. And I want to mention that as this turn has been going on, a context that surrounds it is, of course, public disillusion with globalization. I don't think this always inspires the scholars that I've just mentioned or others, but it is a context in which their books are read and their work is kind of reanalyzing what people think, and a rebranding of globalization as a kind of top-down elitist cosmopolitanism that is no longer thought of as benign. And it's probably also valuable at this point to consider Claudio Sount's warning that graduate programs based in New England, and especially the one at Harvard, have disproportionately represented the region anyway. In his William and Mary Quarterly article, which I recommend to everyone, Go West, Mapping Early American Historiography, Sant gave really comically bulging representations of Harvard's attempts to oversupply the ranks of academic historians and overfill the studies of New England itself, where you would think that everything happened here over and over and over. Point taken. And it's also valuable, I think, to consider that some of the best and most significant recent studies of New England have been about its indigenous peoples, who had not been interested in having the rest of the world invade them, nor being violently transported elsewhere, and whose local history is foundational for understanding New England. In this regard, I want to draw attention to the work of, for instance, Lisa Brooks in her 2 books, The Common Pot and Our Beloved Kin, as well as Christine DeLucia's Memory Lands, that look at New England and its peoples as fixed to New England. Thank you very much. So too has there been consequential pushback among scholars of slave insurrection and liberation movements that reject any narrative giving white people in the 13 colonies, including New England, a leading role in this historical transformation. I do want to end with a few thoughts about what might remain valuable to do in the way of credible 21st century analyses of New England and the world. Where might we go? And I'll mention one track in addition, really, to other work that is being done now, simply because it's close to what I work on, environmental history. I think that the region's environmental history could bear a lot further analysis. And precisely its influences elsewhere, as with its being a model to be followed or shunned, or else as a set of material conditions that have downstream implications for other places. I note that in his near-canonical 1983 book, Changes in the Land, William Cronin mostly focused on New England itself, to a greater extent than he would do in his 1991 Nature's Metropolis, his analysis of Chicago, which made it clear that Chicago had a hinterland that went on and on and on, running over thousands of acres of Midwestern farmland and far into global finance. I think the same could be done to New England, and it's starting to be done in certain studies. I mentioned Jeffrey Bolster's work on the Mortal Sea about regional commercial fishing and its near hemispheric implications, as well as several of Bolster's students or other followers, Chris Pastore and other maritime historians. So too, I think there's a suite of older works that examine the timber industry, from southern New England on up into Canada, greater New England, a topic that few academics have revisited, some but not a lot. And in some ways, I think the best treatment of that topic is Annie Proulx's novel, Barkskins, which takes a far more global view of regional timbering than scholars have done so far. Now, I'm not encouraging attention to New England's environmental history only as a kind of voice of gloom. I can be that voice, and I do think that warnings about the deep impact of colonial ecosystem destruction are necessary, but it may be equally important to see how the region may have been and may yet become a more hopeful example. That New England today may become distinctive as a regional clean energy grid, and again, running from Canada on down through the southern part of southern New England, into southern New England. I think this is extremely important, and a rare cheerful development in anything related to what Amitav Ghosh has called the Great Derangement. Ghosh looking precisely at the dual global destructions wrought by imperialism and ecosystem damage. New England was implicated in that quite definitely, as the academic studies of timbering, enslaving, forced displacement of Indians, taking up of farmland, commercial agriculture, and industrialization have made clear. Looking for counterexamples is, I think, important, and careful descriptions of New England's energy prospects could prove important for other parts of the United States and for the world. There is a possibility that the region will mean that globally. So in terms of tracing that future for New England, we're looking at a kind of reversal of a post-industrial place that went through deindustrialization, but that meant that at some point it went through industrialization and earlier colonization. So back to early New England in its fullest set of global contexts. Thank you.
Just wondering, as we think about New England and the world, do you see scholarship now being done, or a need for looking at sort of New England's kind of race relations sort of history, or the experience of maybe Black or African Americans, right? So given all the historical credit that sort of Massachusetts New England gets for being out in front of abolition, and in the 54th Massachusetts, and Martin Luther King came to the U here, and Bill Russell. I mean, just like, so there are a lot of times where sort of New England has been, on the right side sort of that history, but yet there are a lot of folks sort of in the country who still feel like sort of Boston/New England is still a very racist place, right? might as well as live in Georgia as you live, instead of in Massachusetts, right? All things being equal. So just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
I think it's a really important question, and probably, I think it would be great to have a collaborative kind of project tracing the longer history, which I think has suffered by being kind of truncated, that we know about white abolitionists for the most part. We know about the Civil War, and we know about the parts of the 20th century. And joining these up is, I think, kind of necessary to figure out, well, these don't seem to match, and so how do they happen in the same place? I think one part of that, and going back to something that Jane said that I hope I'm not misunderstanding, and also I think the mention of Lorenzo Green, understanding how black abolitionism took shape in a pretty unpromising environment, and the actual impetus that gave to changing people's lives in Boston, the greater region. So just as a kind of preliminary, because I do think that Boston is a puzzle and a problem that obviously needs to be explained.
I think the one thing I will add on this slightly kind of different topic side of this is looking at with my new project with the NEH, we're trying to catalog slave trade voyages, and the number of Americans involved that coming from New England is frankly astonishing. And I think that there's been a reckoning to a certain extent in New England, but my sense is not a very full one yet. And I attended a talk a few years back at Brown University, in which my colleague, who's also working on a Slave Voyages project with me, was speaking about how he had uncovered documents for Brown and other Rhode Islanders' involvement in slavery and slave trade, and a complete lack of desire to even confront that. I mean, there's kind of a backlash in the audience about this topic, and so I think being willing to take on some of these topics to illustrate fully that you might have abolitionists working and living alongside people who are still actively invested and involved in slave trade or indirectly supporting slavery in a variety of ways, not just within the continental United States.
Well, maybe, I just will add one thing, which is that when I'm teaching at UMass, I have a lot of students who come to my classes who were from Massachusetts, who were in Massachusetts public schools, and often they're surprised to learn about the extent of Massachusetts's involvement in these broader structural processes that we've been, I think, talking about in this panel. And I think it
Just know it wasn't me. I'm one of those.
Oh no!
I'm one of those kids. I taught Bob's kids.
Well, I think it speaks actually to the fact that there's a lot of work that I think needs to continue to be done about linking the kind of research that academics are doing on this with pedagogy, and not just pedagogy in universities, which we talk about quite a lot, but pedagogy beyond that, especially in high school and in middle school, because I think many of these narratives come to be ingrained in folks at that level, and for all bad reasons, increasingly students are not necessarily, when they get to college, taking courses in history and the humanities, and they may not get exposed to these different, and more accurate and less celebratory histories, unless they're actually exposed at an early level, because sadly enough, I think universities are increasingly structuring themselves in ways that don't necessarily push students into the humanities courses where they would have an opportunity to be exposed to this.
Since I had talked about historiography, I should have mentioned that there is an understanding among academic historians that when the Union won the Civil War, they kind of rewrote early American history to say that their hands were clean all along. I'm exaggerating slightly, but that has been incredibly damaging to the admission of how entrenched racism was throughout the United States, and the way in which undoing that was not only the Union Army and white abolitionists based in Boston. And that still needs to be undone, obviously. It will take a while. It's amazing where traces of that old historiography pop up, even well-meaning people, where the textbook didn't bother to kind of rewrite the claim in an important way. Thank you for the question.
So a lot of these threads are coming together for me. If you haven't had the chance to go to Montgomery yet and go to the lynching memorial and the amazing museum that's there, one of the revelations for me was that room that's early on in the museum where each of the colonies or states in the eastern seaboard is featured with the numbers of enslaved people that went through them, and Rhode Island is number 2 on the list. And I was just astonished. The second thing I would say is that someone who grew up in New England, not to take any blame from Harvard, but it is absolutely entrenched in every institution in New England that it's really all about the Pilgrims. And it's nothing else mattered. And as someone who practices public history, I think that museums have a huge role to play here, because that's where a lot of people are getting these stories, not necessarily from scholarly histories. And we need to do a much better job of correcting the record.
I appreciate your comment about the numbers, because that is one of what we're trying to do right now.
Excuse me, Jane, can you just make sure that your mic is on?
It says on. Okay. Is yours or something? Sorry.
That's fine. Is hers the only one that seems to not be?
It says low battery though. I think is what it's saying. Sorry. Yeah.
Do you want to use this one? I don't know.
It looks fine, but you could trade. This one's fine. Is it not?
Oh, well, maybe we should.
Okay, that'll do it.
Sorry about that. No. Okay. In terms of the numbers, we've worked with, I work with the Slave Voyages Project, and we have a website. It was a transatlantic slave trade database, now it's referred to as Slave Voyages. And we've compiled numbers for slaving voyages and trying to track down as much as possible and share that data widely and produce a lot of public outreach, including with museums. So I don't know if the numbers are from that database. They very well could be. And I very much believe that as a scholar, you might get a sense from what I speak about. I'm not a quantitative historian. I'm more interested in the cultural and social and so on. But I do think the numbers matter, and particularly in terms of, as you said, this is something that lingers for you. And as it does for my students, when I show them a map that is showing individual dots of ships leaving Africa, and they see how they speed up in the 18th and 19th centuries, they see where they're going, right? There's a purpose behind this, even though I think scholars might tend to kind of downplay some of that history. So, just thank you for that comment, and I think that that's a great reminder, and I think Asheesh as well, when you were making your comments about schooling. I think this is something we do need to remember.
Thank you. My name's Elizabeth Sorensen, and I'm a former student of Bob Allison at Harvard Extension School. I was interested in your comment, how you said New England sent missionaries to China. I know they sent them to Hawaii because I live in Hawaii.
Yes.
But I'm wondering what kind of impact they had in China, and then if New England sent missionaries to other parts of the world.
This is not something I work on myself, so I have a kind of slightly better than textbook understanding of this, but yes, China was, I gather, particularly famous as a place where New England families went if they sent out missionaries. Though New England also has very interesting and slightly different relations with Japan, which is why there's an excellent Japanese collection at the Museum of Fine Arts. And yes, the Pacific was a common destination. So Hawaii, I'm not sure that if we go to numbers as many, but it was a thing that was regarded as essential for the Christians in New England to carry the gospel into other parts of the world, a longer-term mission, obviously, from kind of international Protestantism of the early modern period. That's about all I know. So I don't know whether anyone else has read about or worked on this.
Maybe you want to speak about India, maybe, or so the Americans tried to send missionaries to India, but the British Empire did expel them as well. So
there you go.
maybe you can speak more about that. But they would have probably gone other places, but were unable to do so. Less welcome, I suppose.
And would that have been the case with parts of Africa as well, that not their...
I've seen no indication that they've sent missionaries to Africa in
interesting.
the periods I've looked at. And the French and the British have missionaries everywhere.
Yeah.
In fact, a very contentious relationship with rulers because they're trying to convert so many people. But I think the Americans either did not feel welcome or, again, they didn't really have the infrastructure to support missionaries to feel safe there.
But it is an amazing impetus that New England was, again, hyper-educated. They had all these very literate people who identified with their church, and off they went. And again, I think there is a secondary literature, not something I work on, but makes a connection to the formation of U.S. diplomatic corps, that these were people who had experience that was seen as relevant.
A sort of self-interested question as somebody who has, as of late, the privilege of running an old New England institution. You know, institutions in New England are as old in many ways as these stories and these narratives. And I wonder if you could just maybe share both the good and the bad of what you would like to see these older New England institutions do in relation, to kind of correcting the story in some way. I think you've all gestured to it in beginning ways, but I'm curious, what are some of the things that these institutions could do to kind of move beyond the branding mythologies they use to help both those who work there and who are educated there, but also who live nearby to understand a truer story?
You didn't want to say after the discussion of missionaries that it's the congregational library.
Yes, I was trying not to make eye contact. As I feel self-conscious because I don't work in a museum, and I feel like those people are busy. They know what they're doing. And it seems to me a lot of institutions are already rethinking this.
They need more pressure on them. They really do. They're still reluctant. Some of them are still reluctant.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of one that I did extensive research in New Bedford because I was working on whalers for part of my book. And the New Bedford Whaling Museum is amazing. And they've done a good job of bringing in the kind of international contributions that you would expect to see. And I have to say, I also spent time doing research in Nantucket, and that museum was a little bit less far along in that. And that's not to malign them in any way. They probably just have a very established collection and a long history, whereas I think New Bedford had reimagined themselves in many ways. But I think there's different ways which to do it, and perhaps some are more successful than others.
Yeah, and it would really depend on what the collection would have. Because, we've been talking about the global dimensions of this, but a lot of bad stuff happened locally. And I don't think that should not be talked about. So I don't think there's a one mandate. But I think undoing that Civil War era of valorizing New England is what every institution ought to think of, because that made it easy to say, well, we may have made mistakes, but not like, and even when true, that's not quite the excuse that people might have thought it was.
I would also just add that I think it's important that while these changes are happening, I think that it's very important to also make visible why they're happening and also the prior history of why they were not presented in the way differently. I mean, I will just anecdotally, I remember, so at historic Deerfield, for example, there is now a great deal of effort to tell a more complete history of settler colonialism and colonial violence in that area. At the same time, if you walk around historic Deerfield and you see the kinds of older commemorative plaques and things that narrate a very different settler colonial history of historic Deerfield, I think that it's actually important to not simply remove those, but I mean, you could remove them, but I think that you don't want to erase that. It's very important that people understand why those narratives were created in the first place, because in all kinds of ways, they still underlie very much the politics of history, historical scholarship, and especially the teaching of history today. And I mean, we need only open up the news to see how that is playing out in, for example, the reaction in Florida to the AP African American Studies curriculum, as well as other efforts in other parts of the country right now to police the teaching of American history, both in universities as well as in elementary and high school. And so I think it's really important to help the public also understand why these things are so contentious to begin with.
Mm-hmm. And I think there are also questions of who the audience is for some different places. I mean, sometimes it's school children, and you can tell the same story, but perhaps differently. There are also a lot of foreign tourists who are coming back. And I often wonder, what when they get back on the plane, what are they thinking? And would I agree with it? Because learning United States history from what Boston says in 2023, interesting. I assume that it's all over the place, depending on where they go.
This relates to 10 minutes ago, but as you may know, Jonathan Chu of UMass Boston has a background that's Chinese, Hawaiian, Congregationalist, and New England. So he might be retired, but I think that he would be a very, if you haven't already, you probably have, he'd be a very interesting person to talk to on this.
Well, and there's a question of Greater New England, where it survives, traces in Hawaii and beyond, and how they represent those connections.
To circle back to the missionaries, while clearly there were very church-related efforts of putting missionaries in China and Hawaii and other places, I think America was a little more indirect in its attempts to do missionary work in Africa, in West Africa in particular, thinking about Liberia, and many of those formerly enslaved Africans who were sent there were sent with the idea that they would help missionize in West Africa. So I think that's something that we have to also keep in mind as we think about that. And one of the other things that as we're looking at this colonial world, many of those black Americans who fought during the Revolution for the British also ended up in many places that the British ended up, including Australia, and had an impact on that as well with their experience fighting for their freedom. So that's another aspect.
Yes, who is a New Englander at that point?
That could be the subject of our next presentation. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.